Professor Ghassan Salamé, welcome to the Geneva Graduate Institute. It's a pleasure to have you. In reflecting on this question of war and peace in the 21st century, in the early 21st century, these questions, of course, are quite permanent and eternal. They are part of human nature. But what's important is also sometimes to try to see what are the drivers of continuity, change, what phases we are in. And reflecting on those, I wanted to start by asking you about the peace component, and specifically the question of democracy. Back in 1996, you had published a book entitled Democracy with Democrats, looking at the question of renewal of politics. And since then, we could arguably see that there is now, particularly since the 2010s, a so-called crisis of democracy, which is playing out both in industrial states or established democracies, but we also see it in halting transitioning processes, democratizations precisely that have not gone forward or even have taken a step back. To what can we attribute this dynamic, which is also running concomitantly with the rise of authoritarianism or neo-authoritarianism?
You are absolutely right. First, let me underline the fact that around the year 2000, for the first time in history, more than 50% of the world population was living under a democratic, more or less democratic system. This has no precedent, and optimism was absolutely legitimate then. We had like 10 democratic countries in the year 19,000, and we had around 120 of them in the year 2000, 12 times more. This is phenomenal. However, something happened, probably around the year 2006, where those who do the mathematics of democracy, the Bertelsmann Foundation, Freedom House, etc., started talking about a plateau. 2006 is also the year of the coup d'etat in Thailand. But since then, we have seen a number of regressions in different forms. First, some countries remained adamantly opposed to the very concept of electoral democracy, like China, Vietnam, Eritrea, etc. Second, you had a number of coups d'etat. Let me talk about Africa for a while. In Africa, you had 16 coups d'etat in the 1990s, then 8 between 2000 and 2010, and then again 8 between 2010 and 2020, but you had 9 in 3 years between 2020 and 2023, which means that coups d'etat are back in Myanmar, in Thailand, and many African countries. 3, democracy has been in a much more insidious way, becoming more shallow in a number of countries where ethno-nationalism is taking the lead. This is the case in India. This is the case in Turkey. This is the case in Russia, in different places. And even in the West, you can see that democracy is now weaker. You may think that in Afghanistan or in Ivory Coast, you would have a candidate who refused the results of the election. But to have it in America, on that day, famous day, January the 6th, with Trump refusing the results of the election in a violent way, is something troubling. Even in Europe, when the Frenchmen were asked to come and decide if they want a presidency of 5 years or 7 years in a referendum, less than 30% participated in that referendum. So there is a regression that is evident in different ways. What is the reason? There is not a single reason, in my view. One of the reasons is certainly the fact that in many countries, democracy was reduced to election.
Right.
And that's why when I was in Iraq, I was opposed to the organization of election before we can really guarantee the safety of all candidates, which we didn't. Because in this kind of circumstances, election is only a way of giving the largest militia or the largest ethnic group a legitimation for their power. This is not election, the way democracy wants it to be.
Well, it's procedural, and it's
only
emptying it out.
Absolutely.
Right.
And another reason that is probably more universal, is the fact that a lot of people have put together the question of democracy and of economic growth. And this is the case in particular in Latin America, where you can see that many presidents, democratically elected, become extremely unpopular a few months after their election because people want economic miracles for their daily life and they don't get it through the election or through democracy. And there is a disenchantment with democracy because it is not producing growth. While there is a counter model. The counter model is the Chinese model or the Vietnamese model, where growth has been produced sometimes double-digit a year with an authoritarian regime. In a year like 2010, the 10 countries with the highest level of growth, 9 of them were authoritarian regimes, and only one, Albania, was a quasi-democracy. Therefore, this is another reason, I think, this confusion between growth and the third thing is certainly the complete failure of democracy promotion by Western countries, especially by the United States. You can't imagine the billions spent on democracy promotion, and all objective audit of this money comes to the conclusion that it has been, to a large extent, squandered. So there are different reasons. I think I have mentioned 3 of them. I could mention others.
Well, clearly, and I think the last one also raises the issue that we have seen as well during the 90s, which is the proliferation of interventionism, military interventionism in the name of humanitarian issues, but oftentimes coupled with a sort of very superficial and politicized kind of promotion of democracy, which was instrumentalized in many places. There's a number of these dynamics that we see playing out like this, and this is creating this tension at the level of society, as you pointed out. But if we tie this to the other sort of big pillar of this particular moment, which is the twin component of this, the martiality component, the war writ large, rather than the technicality of conflict, the technocratic aspect sometimes in some of these studies. During the same time, more or less, and you spoke about different sort of marking moments in this era, if we go back a little bit earlier, in the mid-90s or even a bit earlier, we do have also some sort of evolution, transformation, metamorphosis, hybridization of war. There's all these dynamics playing out, to which later on comes the question of technology. Now, this is also a topic that you had covered in a number of your texts. I want to mention one in particular, the wars of the post-Cold War, which was in an edited volume on the new international relations, trying to sort of gauge the grammar of these dynamics. What struck me in that text at the time was that you did not insist so much on the complexity, the practical complexity of the new wars or the evolving wars, but rather how IR had a hard time, international relations, sort of conceptualizing that which needed to be seen. And sort of, it seems to me that today that is still very much with us. We have this kind of back and forth on the forms of it, but there is an issue fundamentally about that which we should be studying beyond phrases such as war is coming back to Europe, for instance. Do you care to comment on that, please?
Well, I believe that there is something much wider now, which is a pure deregulation of force. Let me insist that if you look at the UN Charter, you will find some kind of tension between Article 2, paragraph 4, that calls for the respect of the integrity or territorial integrity of all countries, on the one hand, and Article 51 that allows for legitimate defense. If you look at the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice and of the Security Council of the United Nations, until the year 2000, around the year 2000, the jurisprudence was very, very restrictive. And in many cases, Nicaragua, Corfu, etc., the ICJ and the Security Council had a very restrictive jurisprudence saying that you cannot use legitimate force the way you want. And then something happened. And what happened is 2 things. On the one hand, we adopted the concept of responsibility to protect, which was used in particular in Libya in 2011. But also, we started the war on terror. And in these two cases, you could see that this restrictive interpretation has been replaced by a much more laxist one, allowing for much more intervention. So this led, or this helped, or facilitated the deregulation of force. You can date that deregulation of force with the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999, which took place without any authorization of the Security Council.
As did Iraq in 2003.
But the main, I would say, act of birth is 2003 in Iraq. This was a war that was not authorized, and it was opposed by many important countries, Russia, China, France, the Vatican, Germany, you name it. And it took place. And it took place based on a concept that has been articulated a year earlier in 2002 in the National Security Strategy of George W. Bush, calling or legitimizing preventive war. So that was a big leap forward towards deregulation of force. Then you had a process of emulation. And this emulation was done by three categories of state. First, large countries. And this is the case of Russia, that intervened in Georgia, intervened in Ukraine in 2014 before invading Ukraine in a completely illegal way in 2022. But this was even more intensely applied by mid-sized powers. And the examples of that are numerous. I would cite in particular the many interventions by Turkey in different places, in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, and elsewhere, and by Iran, that also played a very important role in this. And then you had a third category that appeared, which we call the Little Spartas. And this includes some of the petromonarchies in the Gulf, but also countries like Chad, like Rwanda, which is intervening in many African theaters right now. So there is a global deregulation of force. Not all countries are prone to use this deregulation, but it's spreading like a virus across the international system.
And it's running also in parallel, this deregulation, this democratization of such interventionism, which we do see horizontally indeed, in Kenya and other places, going into Somalia, Chad going into the Sahel, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia into Yemen. This is very much connected in this way in a sort of a strange mirror effect with the role of transnational non-state armed actors who at the same time are proliferating also transnationally, which at the tail end of this, and this is my last question to you, is going to create a new plateau of such sort of deregulation and sort of instability in which these elements are now unpacked in a geopolitical moment, which I wanted to ask a little bit about. So in the more recent of your works as a book, the book of 2005, When America Remakes the World, connecting it also to your calls for empire of 1996, these two works, I think, speak to this kind of evolution of the geopolitics. We see that there is kind of a first kind of moment of opening of this, an opening salvo of this. Jumping to now, we see that since then, as you were saying, a lot has happened. The global war on terror has arguably failed. The Iraq conflict, the Afghanistan issues, we have seen the neocons multiplying their work and ultimately meeting with hubris as they did. And in the meantime, Moscow is now very much in a Mother Russia kind of moment as well. And if we bring in mid-sized powers such as Turkey in an almost neo-Ottoman kind of logic, not to mention the United States, of course, which is very much should be concerned with its own world. There is now this kind of a moment in which it seems to me there are too many variables of predictability that are really very much sort of changing the game. What do you see as sort of this chessboard in the making in already late 2023, for instance?
The best example to confirm what you are saying is the fact that we are completely unable to give a name to the period in which we are. That's an epoch without name. We keep calling it the post-Cold War. Why do we call it the post-Cold War? Because we are unable to give a name to that era. Why? Because there are too many contradictory... Let me take the great powers first. During the Cold War, you had two superpowers with two huge arsenals, nuclear arsenals. But you had, to a large extent, two countries that are not looking to each other when it comes to the economy. We are now in a situation where the USSR and America had $2 billion in trade a year. China and the United States have $2 billion of trade in a day. So to come with the same concept of Cold War and apply it to China is problematic, because it's easy to talk about the Cold War when you don't deal at all with the other side. It's much more difficult when you have a $2 billion daily trade with it.
Of course.
When you have so much money being invested on this side, on the other side, and when you have tens of thousands of students studying in American campuses, etc. So when you have all this interaction taking place and you want to decouple, it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard to talk. So I'm very reserved about the use of concept of Cold War. So it's not a new Cold War. It's something more complex than the Cold War we have witnessed when we were young. Now, there is another problem you mentioned or alluded to, which is, in my view, crucial. There are a number of countries that are at the same time states and empires. Sometimes they play as states and everybody applauds them. They are playing the game, they are into the globalization process, they are free trade, you name it. And sometimes they play the imperial game. And that's the case of Russia, that's the case of Turkey, that's the case of Iran, that's the case of China to a certain extent now in the South China Sea and elsewhere. That sometimes countries who have hybrid in their identity, basic identity, between state and empire, sometimes change the role they are playing. That is why the period we are going through is still not crystallized enough to be given a name. And that's why one of our biggest challenges as experts on international relations is to really christen that period we are going through that is so full of contradictions that it remains anonymous.
Well, for the time being, we can still use the basic concepts of war and peace and simply date them whatever time we're looking at. Well, with that, I want to thank you very much, Professor Ghassan Salamé. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.